Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Let's talk about the legacy that Paul left in this world, his living heritage, we might say. We can think of this in three terms. First of all, in terms of the people that Paul brought to Christ, that was part of his legacy. Another part of his legacy is the corpus of letters, all of those letters that he wrote. And then another part of his legacy were his disciples and other writings that they created, some of which they wrote in his name and in his spirit. Let's begin with the people that Paul brought to Christ. Paul describes the people that he writes to in some of his letters as his hope, his joy, his crown. He calls them the stars of his universe. In other places, Paul refers to himself as their father in Jesus Christ. And in his letter to the Galatians, Paul talks about it, how it was that he labored like a mother until Christ was formed in them. A beautiful maternal image of his relationship to them as well. In his first letter to the Thessalonians, Paul speaks about how he was gentle with them, like a nursing mother. Imagine that for a moment. In the same way that a mother nurses her young child and is gentle with that child, Paul gives us that image that he was gentle with the people and nourished the people in the same way. What a beautiful image. He also often referred to them as his brothers and sisters, or in his letter to the Philippians, he calls them his partners in the gospel. How it is that he was acknowledging that they shared in that preaching of the gospel. They heard the gospel, and it was now their task to go out and to share that gospel with others. Interestingly, though, Paul could also be very harsh with the people. As we'll see later this evening, his letter to the Galatians is just plain harsh. In his letter to the Galatians, for instance, he chastises the people of Galatia, calling them fools. Can you imagine getting a letter in which a person you respect, like St. Paul, refers to you and your friends, your community members, as fools? He also warned the Corinthians that when he came, he would not be lenient. And this is worth our looking at. We'll turn to the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 2. St. Paul tells the Corinthians, he says, "On my return to Corinth, I will not spare those who sinned earlier or any of the others." It gives us this image of Paul being more firm with the people. But Paul was not afraid to challenge people. And in fact, one of his greatest challenges was when he challenged people to imitate him in the same way that he imitated Christ. So think about that for a moment, how beautiful that was. In the same way that Paul was trying to imitate Christ, he was encouraging others to imitate him. And we know that they imitated him. At least in his first letter to the Thessalonians, he tells them, "You became imitators of us and of the Lord." How it was that the people in Thessalonica became imitators of Paul and those who were preaching with Paul to the people. It's fascinating because at that time the image was that we were to imitate Paul and the apostles. We called it the apostolic life. In fact, that model of communal life that we have in the Acts of the Apostles, the apostolic life, became the model for religious life. For life in the monastery, for the early monks, we have them imitating this apostolic life. Which is why what St. Francis of Assisi tried to do, we remember that St. Francis of Assisi lived from 1182 to 1226. And in that time, what was so radical about what St. Francis did was that he was not trying to live like the apostles. He wasn't trying to follow St. Paul and Peter and the early apostles. Instead, he had this radical idea that he was going to follow in the footsteps of Christ. You see, St. Francis lived in an era where they literally interpreted many passages of the Bible. And if you literally interpret the last book of the Bible, the book of the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation, it gives you the sense that there are only 144,000 seats in the bleachers of heaven. Follow me now. If heaven has only 144,000 seats, St. Francis and the theologians of his day, they were thinking to themselves, wait a minute, if the Blessed Virgin Mary is in heaven, that's one seat that's filled. What about Peter and the apostles? That's 12 more seats. The early saints of the church, the early martyrs, they were doing the math and figuring out that there couldn't be many seats left in the bleachers of heaven. And so what did that mean for St. Francis of Assisi? He knew that in order to get one of those seats, he was going to have to elbow his way past some very holy women who spent a lot of time praying at church. And so rather than imitating the apostles, who did Francis imitate? He decided to imitate the Lord, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And so if the gospel said that Jesus was poor, how was St. Francis going to live? He was going to be poor as well. And if the Gospels said that Jesus instructed his disciples to only take with them the tunic that they wore and to put their trust in God, St. Francis was going to do likewise. He was going to trust that God would provide for him and for his brothers and sisters. Another part of Paul's legacy is Paul's letters. The letters that survive to today, his extant letters. It's interesting because no other follower of Jesus left behind so much written testimony as St. Paul did. Yes, we have the Gospels, which were purportedly written by various apostles, but as we remember from our study of the Synoptic Gospels, we really don't believe that those Gospels were written by people who were right there with Jesus. Instead, we suspect that it's more likely that those Gospels were written by people who actually heard the stories. So, for instance, the Gospels of Mark was often traditionally attributed to John Mark, who was a companion of Paul. And so it makes sense that, for instance, a person like John Mark, if he indeed wrote the Gospel of Mark, would have heard his stories from Mark rather than actually being a companion of Jesus. Do we actually think that St. Luke knew Jesus? No. In fact, we know that St. Paul traveled with Luke, that Luke traveled with St. Paul, so it's likely that Luke, too, would have heard stories of Jesus from the likes of Paul. And of course, we have the other two Gospels, Matthew and John, which are attributed to apostles, but as we learned in our course on the Synoptic Gospels, it's not likely that Matthew or John actually were with Jesus, but were writing in the name and in the spirit of those early apostles. It's interesting because Luke actually wrote a bit more than Paul. St. Paul's letters comprise over 32,000 words. St. Paul wrote over 32,000 words that survive to the present day. Luke wrote nearly 38,000 words, both in the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles, which we remember is the Gospel of Luke part 2 after Jesus ascended into heaven. But the difference is that we scarcely know anything about St. Luke. So how interesting that through Paul's letters we learn a lot about Paul, and also, of course, through the Acts of the Apostles. But Luke doesn't tell us a lot about himself, neither in the Gospel of Luke nor in the Acts of the Apostles. And so we have this much more vivid picture of Paul from the works that survive. And finally, the third piece of Paul's legacy is the disciples and their writings that he left behind. We know, for instance, that St. Paul tells us that he gave letters to be carried by Silvanus and Timothy and Titus, which is likely why those letters of Paul to Timothy and Titus were attributed to Paul. We know them as the pastoral letters, but we also know that just because we have this datum, how it was that Paul shared letters with Timothy and Titus, that doesn't necessarily mean that Paul wrote those letters that we have today to Timothy and Titus. Rather, they were written in Paul's name and in Paul's spirit. Another legacy that Paul left behind were his disciples Prisca and Aquila. We talked about that the last evening that we were together, how it was that he met them in Corinth, and how it was that these two faithful women moved and stayed with him in Ephesus, and how it was later that when he was under house arrest in Rome, that Prisca and Aquila came to be with him in Rome as well. Another interesting disciple of his we learn about in his letter to Philemon. It was the slave Onesimus. We hear in that letter how it is that Onesimus was a slave who belonged to his master Philemon, but then escaped and came to Paul. And so it's the likes of, we just have this image of Paul being this attractive figure who drew people to him, including the likes of Onesimus. We also have stories, for instance, of how it was that Paul warmly received the deaconess Phoebe. He speaks of her in his letter to the Romans. And how interesting, because Paul mentions the deaconess Phoebe, that blows apart any argument that we've heard from the Roman Catholic Church on why it is that women should not be ordained for ministry. Answer me this. If women were recognized as deaconesses and shared in the ministry of the early church, why should women not be allowed to share in the ministry and in the ordained ministry of the church today? The exclusion of women by the Roman Church, as we previously learned during our course on the theology of the presbyterate, of the priesthood and the diaconate, we learned during that course that women actively participated in ordained ministry for at least the first 600 years of the church. And the deaconess Phoebe was one part of Paul's legacy, as we find in his letter to the Romans. But others wrote about Paul or wrote in Paul's name, which is so fascinating, that St. Paul's legacy not only comes down to us through those letters that he left, but also St. Luke. Just recall how much of the Acts of the Apostles speaks about the ministry and the preaching, the life of St. Paul. That was a lot of ink dedicated to this figure of St. Paul. Half of the Acts of the Apostles is dedicated to the spread of Christianity by Paul. It's also interesting because St. Luke in the Acts of the Apostles places Paul right beside Peter in the pantheon of saints. We know that every June 29th as a church, we celebrate the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. So how interesting that these two saints whom we celebrate together, Peter and Paul, were recognized really as being two important followers of Jesus, even in Paul's day. But an even greater tribute to Paul is the fact that at least 6 people wrote letters in his name. Imagine that. He had such authority. His name meant so much in the early church that people wrote letters in his name and in his spirit. We refer to them as the pseudonymous or Deutero-Pauline letters. The Deutero-Pauline letters, we know, were not written by Paul, but they were attributed to Paul in the early church. And so even though we don't know who wrote them, which is why we call them pseudonymous letters, even though we don't know who wrote them, who wrote these pseudonymous letters, they were written and attributed, they were written in Paul's name and attributed to him. One example is the letter to the Colossians. We used to refer to it as the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians. Now we know that St. Paul didn't write the letter to the Colossians, but the letter is important because it's written in Paul's name, and it develops Paul's themes of Christology, ecclesiology, and eschatology. His what? We remember that Christology is one's theology of Christ, of Jesus. So the letter to the Colossians develops Paul's Christology. The letter also develops Paul's ecclesiology. The word ecclesiology comes from the Greek word ecclesia, which means assembly. It's the theology of the church. Your ecclesiology is your theology of the church. And so the letter to the Colossians, even though it wasn't written by St. Paul, is very important because it helps to develop Paul's ecclesiology. And finally, the letter to the Colossians helps to develop Paul's eschatology. We may remember that the word eschaton refers to the end times. And so eschatology is the study of the end times, of the end of the world. And so Colossians is important for developing Paul's theology of the end times, his eschatology. And what's fascinating is that the letter to the Colossians applies these to a larger church. So St. Paul wrote to local churches, to the church in Corinth, or the church in Rome, or the church in Thessalonica, or to the churches in Galatia. What happens is the letter to the Colossians expands this view to a larger and more universal church with a capital C. Another example of a pseudonymous letter is the letter to the Ephesians. We no longer believe that the letter to the Ephesians was written by Paul, but it speaks of some very fascinating themes of how it is that we're all called to be one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. It speaks of this theme of oneness, how all of us are called to be one. And finally, we have those three pseudonymous letters that we refer to as the pastoral letters. Those are the first letter to Timothy, the second letter to Timothy, and the letter to Titus. We no longer believe that those were written by St. Paul, but how fascinating that we have those three other examples of letters that were written in Paul's name and in Paul's spirit. We suspect that they were written at a later time because they deal with church structures that were not in place during the time of Paul. And also it's fascinating because these pastoral letters downgrade and degrade women in a way that we don't see in Paul's letters, and speak of various heretical dangers that we don't see. And so we don't believe that these pastoral letters were written by Paul, but they are important because they were written in his name and are part of his legacy. That this figure, St. Paul, was so important to the early church that people wrote to various communities in his name and in his spirit.